Hello, everybody, and welcome officially to our live conversation on Facebook. It will be available also on Instagram later. I am Jacqueline. I am joined by Gabi. We are live streaming into the Yoga Teachers Forum and also into my private profile page. The only place we're not live streaming is in Gabi's profile page, but I think you can all hopefully reach us at all our different places. I'm so excited to be joined by Gabi today for this super interesting conversation. Gabi, are you with me?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. So today, the only thing is I've lost you on an image as an active image on my screen. So I hope that everyone, oh, now I've got you back. Okay. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. It is related to the Understanding Fertility Challenges workshop that I am running on Monday, the 18th of October. And Gabi and I have met through Julia, through the Yoga Teachers Forum. And as a result of that workshop that I'm doing, I was speaking to her about a couple of issues and topics. And we wanted to bring that conversation online to our live audience so that you can all hear the conversations that we were having and basically make our private conversation public for all of you, because I think it's going to be really, really beneficial. I definitely have learned tons from you, Gabi, already, and I'm so honored that you're taking the time to educate me personally more in this area of fertility. So maybe I'll present my sort of specific challenge or the reason why I really wanted to talk to you, and then I'm going to let you go on your soapbox and educate all of us. So I come from the world of yoga for women's health, and my yoga practice and my yoga teaching has always been very female and feminine orientated because of the trainings that I had, because that I'm a woman and I identify as feminine. I'm in a heterosexual relationship with my husband. I am married. And so that is my frame of reference. That is my world. That is sort of where I come from. But as I was planning and preparing for this fertility workshop, it became very obvious to me that a heterosexual woman who is trying to get pregnant is only one demographic that would need to go on a fertility journey, go on fertility treatment, go through IVF. And then after conversations with you also, it became very clear to me that that is only one type of person. And there are other types of people who may choose or need to go on a fertility journey in order to become pregnant. And I really want to hear from you about that larger, broader, wider demographic, and to understand the language, the nuances, and for myself to really be educated about all those sensitivities that need to be taken into account when discussing this specific topic. So I'm going to hand it over to you and let you talk a little bit, and I may interject with some questions and also ask you about the language that I have commonly used and how you feel about that language and what would be maybe a more appropriate, more inclusive language to use. So go for it, Gabi.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Yeah, thank you so much for kind of reaching out and starting these conversations, because I think they're so important, and I think it's also really brave to have this conversation live. Like, I think we often put out, publicly on social media, like we are really put together and we know all the answers, and actually the world of being unsure is a difficult place to publicize. So I think that's really powerful and I really appreciate it. My background is also yoga. I've been teaching yoga for a number of years, but more recently really focusing on LGBT plus inclusion, LGBT plus spaces, as well as teaching pregnancy and postnatal yoga. So right from when I started teaching around pregnancy and the whole perinatal period, it was really from that place of wanting to make sure that a whole range of people would be supported in my space. So I've had a number of LGBT couples come through my pregnancy and postnatal yoga classes, which is really beautiful and a really special thing to be part of. I think the first thing that I always like to say is I can't give all the answers to a person. Part of this journey is really looking at what you teach, what you do, and who it's for, and what the right language is for you and your demographic. So I'm not going to give you clear, cut and dry answers of this is the one way you should always say it, because nothing's ever that simple. And there will be people who may not like the language that I use. There's no perfect one right way, but I'll try to give some suggestions, options, and reasons for certain language and choose to use other language. And then the last thing that I'll say, just kind of before we dive into the nitty-gritty of actual language that we might use, I think it's worth, if you really want to create to make your space more welcoming, particularly for LGBT people or really any marginalized minoritized group, sometimes taking that journey of edging yourself, sometimes teach as if there are always LGBT plus people in the, whether they're part of the LGBT plus community or not. So better language, and then change your marketing. But I think sometimes we can be so keen to put out there really lovely inclusive marketing when actually the class isn't quite ready, or you as the facilitator or the teacher aren't quite ready. So that's kind of where I start, but I think it's worth familiarizing yourself with maybe the language that you are using that could be tweaked or adapted in certain ways.
Yeah.
How does that sound to start with?
Yeah, that sounds really great, because ever since my conversations with you, I've realized, because of my education, because of my background, because of the language, the yoga language that I have been taught, I use phrases like feminine energy, feminine hormones, feminine creativity. Everything is with the word feminine or female in front of it. And so now I'm trying to think, okay, what word would I use that would be more inclusive, but would still incorporate that feminine element?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And I think one other thing that you've just reminded me of, it's easy. I think I've definitely heard a lot of yoga teachers say, oh, well, when that LGBT plus person walks into my class, then I'll change my language. And sometimes by that point, it's too late, because we've all grown up and live in this society that centers one particular narrative around fertility and pregnancy and birth. And it takes time to adapt that language, even if you know that you want to. And I find things coming out of my mouth before I've thought enough. Sometimes just speaking slower and taking time can be really helpful, but it sometimes takes practice. So you sent me a whole list of words that you noticed, I think, as you were preparing for your training next week, that you were using, that you wanted to dive into, and I really, really love this list. Do you want to pick one and we'll kind of do a back and forth?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is feminine energy, which, can I maybe tell you what I mean by that? When I talk about feminine energy or feminine,
that would be great.
Yeah, or connecting to your authentic feminine self, I think those two phrases for me relate to the feminine, the femininity as depicted by feminine hormones. So a woman or someone who identifies as female who has feminine reproductive hormones, estrogen, progesterone, LH, FSH. Those hormones for me, in my sort of the way that I relate to them, they not only are biological hormones, they also have characteristics. And you see that if you are experiencing a monthly cycle, you will feel different at different stages of the month. And those different feelings, those different characteristics are not just you, Gabi, or me, Jacqueline. Those are sort of much more intrinsic in the way that the hormones express themselves in a physical, emotional way. So there is the biology of it, but then there is an expression of how the hormones make you feel and act and interact. So for me, connecting to your authentic feminine self, or your feminine energy, is connecting to creativity, intuition, introspective, being able to potentially multitask, being able to see things in a specific way. Times in your month where estrogen is dominant and you feel that you're super creative and you can take on the world and you're able to do things, or when progesterone in your cycle is more dominant and you're more introvert, you need more time for yourself. So that for me is expressed in this language of authentic feminine self or feminine energy. And I wonder what language I would use and what sensitivities I would use if I was working with a couple or a person who was anywhere on the LGBT spectrum, and sort of what would be an appropriate language to use?
Good question. But I'm going to kind of start where you finished and backtrack. So the first thing that I always think is really helpful is if you're working with one person or a couple, you can ask them what language they want. And actually the local hospital to me in Brighton has recently done that specifically for trans and non-binary birthing people. Is they've got a list of, these are the words that we often use about birth, and you just write on the form, instead of this word, I want that word. And I actually think we should be doing that if we're working one-to-one with someone for everything. Yeah. Whether it's because someone doesn't like that language, it doesn't feel comfortable, maybe they've got an experience of trauma, whatever the reason is. If someone tells me that they want to call any part of their body with wobblies, that's what I want to do. Might not be my preference, but that for me is part of making space as safe as possible. That really nice place to start. I think probably everyone can get on board with that quite easily. It's obviously a little tricky if you're working in a group setting, because it's unlikely that a group of people with all of their various different experiences are all going to want exactly the same language. Yeah. But if you're working one-to-one, really easy. There was one point in what you were saying earlier that I think you said really beautifully. You talked about how when estrogen is dominant in your cycle, you might feel creative and have and those things. When it's dominant cycle, you might feel more introverted and that kind of thing. That is a really beautiful way of talking about it that actually doesn't really have any gender as part of it. Anyone who has that experience of their cycle will experience that. And for you, that's part of your femininity and part of your feminine energy and feminine creativity, and that's really beautiful. But for someone who maybe doesn't identify with that feeling of femininity, the feminine part of the language might put them off. Actually, the hormones are going to be the same. If those are the hormones that are dominant in your body. So actually, in that bit of sentence that you said, I think was perfect. So I'll kind of wrap up that section.
Yeah.
I think.
So you're saying that.
I think it's worth acknowledging.
So what I'm hearing you say is that if we what I'm hearing you saying is that if I stick to the biology, the anatomy, without placing on it some type of nuance, I sort of keep it maybe gender neutral, for want of a better phrase, that is a better way of engaging in the conversation rather than putting my gender identity on the biology and anatomy.
I think that would really work for some people. As I said, there's not exactly a one size fits all, but definitely that's one approach that I take. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that the way that you experience it in terms of your femininity is also really powerful. There will be people who really want to attach their feminine identity to that, and there'll be people who don't. And so that's where sometimes it can be a tricky balance in a group setting.
Yeah.
But definitely one way would be to talk about it from that more biological, more anatomical sense, rather than, the gender sense.
Right. 1 second. Yeah, really, really interesting. I was just having in my head a thought that as I was doing, I know we didn't preempt this, but as we were doing, as I was doing research on the statistics of heterosexual women who are going through IVF treatment, and I was looking for research and statistics and data, it was really hard actually to find data on the non-heterosexual women who are going through fertility and IVF. So anyone from the LGBT community, anyone who is a single woman who wants to get pregnant and by herself, anyone who is maybe of an older, who isn't necessarily being diagnosed with any infertility challenges, but she's just an older woman and wants to, go in and get pregnant. And the statistics and the data of that were really hard to find. And I wonder if that also adds to an element of non-engagement of the conversation with different demographics who are choosing fertility treatment, because there is that typical assumption that 99% of the people going through fertility treatment is going to be a heterosexual woman who can't get pregnant.
Yeah, I don't know if those statistics would be available. I haven't found them. The best I found was a study specifically around the LGBT community that showed that I think it was 63% of millennials, so at that point was sort of 18 to 35-year-olds, 63% were planning to grow their family either by having children or by having more children. So that's a really high proportion of the LGBT community. I think it's also probably different in different locations. So I know where I live in Brighton, there's a huge LGBT community, and one of the local fertility clinic to me have a specific part of their website particularly for LGBT plus people. So they might have statistics of who comes through their specific facility. But I imagine that also particularly historically, some people may not necessarily mention that the person who's going to get pregnant goes in, at least in the UK, if you give birth, you're recorded on a birth certificate as the mother, even if you've got a gender recognition certificate that says that you're legally a man, you still go down on the birth certificate as a mother. So there's no record of that person being trans and giving birth. There's not necessarily a record of the partner of whoever's giving birth or their gender identity. So I don't, because of the situation that we're in terms of the legality, often those statistics aren't recorded.
Yeah.
So
yeah, interesting, because I guess legally within the UK healthcare system, the person that gives birth by definition is a woman and therefore the mother. And if there is any other, definition than that person chooses to identify with, that isn't recorded. And if that person is in any form of relationship or otherwise is not necessarily recorded. And fascinating.
Well, I think
that's very interesting.
Yeah, and so there was a recent court case about this language that Freddie McConnell was the sort of centre of, where the judge actually said that the term mother, because basically Freddie wanted to be recorded on his child's birth certificate as either father or parent. He was the one giving birth. But the law in the UK was you have to go down as mother. And the judge said that mother is not a gendered term. So recognise that Freddie is a man and has a gender recognition certificate and is legally a man, but because he has to go down on the birth certificate as mother, it's therefore no longer gendered, which makes no sense to me. And I'm sure a lot of mothers do feel like it's a very gendered term.
Yeah.
So it's definitely a bit of a legal issue. And I've also heard of LGBT women. So if a woman's giving birth and her partner is a woman, in some places, just because of the paperwork that you have, that it says mother and you write that person's name, and then it says father, and it's a woman's name that goes under that, but you still have to write it next to father. I can't imagine that feeling nice. It's a really outdated system, and it wouldn't be that difficult to change, but that's our stupid legal system.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating, I think, the depth to which, when you understand the complexities, that it's not just about a woman or someone who identifies as female or anyone who is trying to get pregnant and then goes through fertility treatment, potentially IVF, and then gives birth. There's a massive system around that very simple journey. If you are not a heterosexual woman identifying as a woman, which you just don't even, you're not even aware of. And what I wanted to maybe talk about is that emotional, mental health element of the journey, because for a heterosexual woman who is trying to get pregnant, the journey is tough enough. The journey is emotional enough. The journey is challenging enough. And if you have to add layers onto that, maybe we can just talk about that for a minute.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is where I get a bit sad, because there are so many amazing like fertility yoga and pregnancy yoga classes that are so powerful and so important, but are just inaccessible to so many LGBT plus people because it's not a space that has them in mind. Like you say, any journey of growing your family that starts at home in your own bedroom, takes a few months, and then there's a baby. As soon as that pathway that we assume is normal is disrupted in any way, it starts getting more stressful. So for LGBT plus people, that often means a huge amount more money. I know in the UK it's very rare to get any support on the NHS, so you might have to self-fund buying sperm or eggs, depending on what you need. You can't pay for a surrogate in the UK like you could in America, but that means that it's much harder to get a surrogate. You might have to pay for IUI or IVF at a fertility clinic potentially multiple times. But then there's also the emotional toll it takes when either, during that journey, during your pregnancy, during birth, people are making the wrong assumptions. So I've heard of trans men giving birth in labor, and someone walks in and says, "Oh, how's mummy doing?" That is not, the hormones and the feeling you need to be able to birth a baby. Wow. That is not it. Or equally, if your partner's a woman, a midwife coming in and say, "Oh, is this your sister coming to help?" and it's your wife. That doesn't make you feel safe or comfortable or accommodated.
I'm smiling, and I hope you don't take that in the wrong way, but it's just a total light bulb moment of oh my gosh, yes, these are things we just don't think about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost laughable. It would be funny if it wasn't so horrible and if it didn't have such a big impact. So I think, when you layer all of those experiences, needing assisted reproduction or fertility support, the cost of it, the fact that every part of the perinatal journey is so woman-centered, and so, like you say, kind of heteronormative, assuming that, you know, even hypnobirthing scripts that refer to husband, like even forgetting that the person that you're having a baby with, you might not be married to, like,
Yeah.
there's it just feels like we need to move past some of that,
Yeah.
I think.
And I wonder if I can bring up
Yeah.
another point, and I want to try and do it in the most sensitive way. When a couple in a heterosexual relationship are trying to get pregnant, they are both involved. In most cases, there is the egg and the sperm from this couple that is doing the journey together. And even though we know that the woman is the one that needs to bear the hormone injections and the waiting and the pregnancy and the everything, she has a man by her side who has been involved in it. Most times it's using his sperm, and they're sort of going on the journey together. And I'm wondering, in a same-sex couple relationship, there needs to be a third party there, whatever combination you have. And I'm wondering if you can even talk to, if there is even discussion about the role that the partner plays and the role that the third person plays in that dynamic. And I'm only thinking about it now as we're talking, you know, all these things are coming up for me that obviously, you know, I would never have thought of before, but I know that you are so familiar with and how it's being dealt with. And it's some things that I want us to bring out. I want us to talk about, because we should be all aware. All of us should be aware that these are the interchange and the nuances that are at play here.
Yeah. So if you're in a couple where you both have uteruses, regardless of your gender, regardless of anything else, just two uteruses, you're missing sperm in the situation. There's a number of different ways that can happen. So if you've got a friend or a family member or someone you know who you want to donate sperm, that would be described as a known donor. And that dynamic can look like a number of different things. I would always be really careful about not referring to the donor as the father or the dad, unless particularly in that family setup they've got some sort of, you know, co-parent situation. That's the only way, at least in the UK, that you can do it at home. You can take that sperm, put it where it needs to go, and get pregnant. If you don't have a person like that to ask, then you need to buy sperm from a sperm bank. In that situation, you don't know who it's coming from. So that person doesn't have any kind of relationship, but I've definitely seen, I'm in a number of Facebook groups online, conversations about the gestational parent, the parent who's pregnant, really wanting to make sure that the other parent feels part of that journey and process, which actually I think we should all be doing. Of course, all the parents should be feel part of that. Or some people will do something called reciprocal IVF. So they'll take the eggs from one partner and the other partner will carry them, which is a nice way that both parents feel involved. One of them is biologically related to the child and the other one carried the child.
That's really special. I've never heard of that before.
It's really special, but it does have an extra complication in that when you then fill out all your forms at the hospital about, you know, the parents and the conditions and that sort of thing, it's always assumed that the person who's pregnant, it's their biological egg. And that's not always the case. So that's where sometimes things can get missed if the practitioner doesn't ask the right questions. And then on the other side, if you're in a relationship where you both have sperm and you're missing an egg, that's where you need a surrogate. You need someone. And again, that could be a friend or family member, or it could be someone you meet. There are forums online and events and stuff to connect with surrogates. In I only really know about the UK and America. In America, there are far more surrogates around, but they can charge money. So it can be thousands of pounds to pay a surrogate.
Yeah.
In the UK, you can't pay a surrogate. I think you can only pay their medical expenses, but that means there are fewer of them, so they can be a bit harder to find. You have to choose whose sperm you want to use, or you can use the sperm, mix them together and
Mix
just
and
see what
match.
yeah. And that could be done at home, or again, you might be paying for a fertility clinic for IVF or IUI, and you also have the consideration about whose egg you're going to use. So will it be the surrogate's egg, or are you going to use an egg donor? And I think the same thing, there's a very different thing when it's for anyone who's using a surrogate for whatever reason, that's an extra thing that can make you feel a bit less connected to your child until they're actually in your arms.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a sort of legal thing that, again, whoever gives birth to the child in the UK is legally considered the mother until the intended parent adoption goes through. So in COVID, that's meant that there are some surrogates giving birth and they don't have the intended parents in the room because they weren't allowed in the hospital and that sort of thing. So those, first decisions after the baby is born, or if anything isn't quite going to plan, you haven't actually got the intended parents there to make those decisions. The surrogate has to make those decisions.
Right.
So, surrogacy can be a really, really beautiful journey. I've supported surrogates in my pregnancy yoga class. There can be an amazing way that works, but it's more things to think about, more things to consider that, again, isn't the dominant narrative.
Fascinating, really fascinating. I want to bring it back to yoga teachers and how we as yoga teachers can support whoever we're working with, the pregnant person in front of us, and to talk, or the person going on the fertility journey, and talking about the actual, in my workshop, I am going to be focusing specifically on IVF and that journey in and of itself, which as yoga teachers, we can play a really significant supportive role in that journey. Again, whether it's in a one-to-one basis or in a group basis, you may choose to, as a yoga teacher, have a group specifically dedicated to people going through fertility or infertility. Or you may be working directly one-on-one with a person, with their partner. But I think at the end of the day, whoever the person is in front of you, if they have gone or are going on a fertility journey, if they have chosen to go through IVF for whatever reason, I think there's a lot of commonality that person, whoever they are, is experiencing. And I think that even though there are nuances and sensitivities and language and that we need to be super, super conscious of and super aware of, at the end of the day, I think there is also a lot of commonality that these different people will be experiencing, whoever it is that is in front of you. And I wonder if we can maybe talk a little bit about that. I don't know how familiar you are with supporting people along that journey, but I think that the hormones that person needs to take, the uncertainty, the waiting, the expectation, maybe the disappointment, maybe the success, and then, the nervousness, the anxiousness, all those emotions. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they are probably the same with whoever the person is in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. I've supported a few people through IVF. It's not like my specialty, but I've had people in classes who are going through that journey. And yeah, absolutely. I think the only added layer, it's going to be challenging for anyone going through it. The only added layer is that extra financial investment that some LGBT plus people might be going through, or the extra feeling even more uncomfortable potentially in those settings. And if they, I had a quote from one of my clients, I haven't got it to hand, but they put really beautifully why finding a space within their yoga practice that they could feel safe to explore that journey, like why that was so powerful, because so much of that journey to getting pregnant not only was difficult for all the reasons that it's difficult for everyone, but also felt invalidating, felt like it wasn't set up for them, felt like they constantly had to be reminding people of the language or ignoring the little things that people got wrong. So for them, being able to feel safe coming into a yoga class, that they could, let the nervous system calm, they could drop into their body and know that those things weren't going to be an issue again, is so powerful. And actually, for the journey of creating your family, especially as a person who is trying to get pregnant, will be pregnant and will then give birth, those feelings of safety and security, feeling calm, that whole parasympathetic nervous system is so important.
Yeah.
And if you can create that for someone in a class, that is one of the most powerful things, I think, for anyone, but especially on that journey, is so important.
Yeah. I agree. One more thing I want to ask you, and then maybe we can try and wrap up our feelings and sentiments, is around the terminology and relationship to pelvis and reproductive organs and the reproductive area. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing in the workshop is really talking about how us as yoga teachers want to create that biological, anatomical space of openness through opening up the pelvis. Again, I'm going to tell you the language that I would use. Opening up the pelvis, having blood flow pumping around the reproductive organs, wanting to create an openness, relax the pelvic floor muscles so that there is an openness and a readiness to accept the incoming pregnancy. Maybe the person is about to have their eggs extracted, and again, to create that very relaxed atmosphere around the anatomical areas. And I would use language like pelvis, uterus, reproductive organs, blood flow, openness. Again, probably, now I'm always checking myself, but probably things like, feminine energy, feminine source, connecting to your feminine source, connecting to your feminine reproductive organs, and just allow it, because often the person is so disconnected from that part of their anatomy because of the journey that they're going on, because of the medicalization of the process, the artificial way that the process has to be, that there's such a disconnect that they just don't want to have to get emotionally involved in a way because of the potential disappointment, because of the anxiety. So just asking you how would I relate to that with a non-heterosexual woman in front of me with,
So again, I'll go back to, if it's a one-to-one, I would always ask the person what they want. That's my starting point. And I attended a yoga class this morning with a teacher who I love, and it was all themed around the pelvis. And they use beautiful language that is really inclusive. So it's really fresh in my mind to talk about this stuff. I think the way you started talking about the pelvis, reproductive organs, blood flow, those are things that everyone has. If you were teaching any yoga class, you could talk about reproductive organs, pelvis, and blood flow. We all have that. Now, for some people, that's going to be harder to connect with than others, just like you said. All of that language generally, I think, is absolutely fine in a class. Again, in a specific situation with an individual, I might not, but generally I would use all of those words. When you start talking about specific organs or the kind of femininity aspect of it, that's where it gets a little bit more sticky. So some people feel absolutely fine with saying, I have a uterus, that is where my baby's going to grow, so I'm going to connect with that area. Some people don't like that language. What I find, maybe I'll flip it to the pelvic floor, because that's something I talk about a lot. If I want to talk about the muscles of the pelvic floor, and I'm talking specifically for people who are pregnant, I might say something about the muscles around the vagina, the muscles around the urethra, and the muscles around the anus. Now, the word vagina might not be the most comfortable for a trans man in my class. So I'm going to be really sensitive about that. I would firstly try and make sure in advance that they know that that's coming up. So maybe having it in the class description or the workshop description, giving some sort of inkling that that's what we're going to be talking about. If I am saying, I probably won't repeat it over and over and over again. I'm not going to keep saying vagina the whole time. I might say it once at the beginning. So I might say, urethra at the front, vagina in the middle, anus at the back. And then I can just say the front of the pelvic floor, the middle and the back, without keep repeating that word that might not be the most comfortable. It's not a perfect solution, and it definitely wouldn't work for everyone, but that seems to be the balance that I take. Very clear in my language, wanting to use in that sense an anatomical terms so people know what to trigger someone. In terms of the uterus, that same. And I know there's some yoga teachers who talk about womb energy and that sort of thing that can be really beautiful and healing for some people, but not for everyone. So it might be relevant to talk about the uterus briefly in that kind of anatomical sense, but maybe not the whole way through the practice. That's my current kind of stuff. Didn't need, especially if I've got a mixed group of maybe quite a lot of women and some non-binary people or trans men in the class. I think also on the kind of feminine energy and feminine authenticity and that sort of language, I think it's also important to mention that some trans women who don't have a uterus, don't have a menstrual cycle, that language might be really empowering for them. So there's space for a yoga class that's a feminine flow or Shakti flow or women's yoga that isn't specifically about the reproductive side, but about embracing those aspects of gender that can be really beautiful, that a trans man is not going to want to come to, but a trans woman might love.
Wow. Okay. Well, what I can say after about 45 minutes of talking to you is that it is very complicated. And what I'm taking away from all of this is that, and I've written it down, always ask the person in front of you, because that's the best way to get the answer. And I am very much always now beginning to check myself on the language, and I know I will not get it right, even 10% of the time, but I am super aware that I need to have the awareness. And I hope that at least is the first stage to being able to be as inclusive as possible. I'd just like to ask you for some closing thoughts, if there's anything that you really would like to share that we haven't discussed, or some real takeaway for me, for anyone listening.
Yeah, I think that's such a good place to be in. I think it's really exciting. I think, yes, there's a lot, and it can seem really complicated, and definitely if we're talking about how people grow their families, there can be lots of stuff to consider. But actually getting back to that thing of who's the person in front of you, what do they need, that becomes quite simple. And I can already hear, just from our conversations over the last couple of weeks, your language, it's not that the femininity and femaleness of language needs to completely be got rid of, because some of that is really beautiful and important for some people, but I can already see your language changing just in terms of you thinking about the breadth of what your offering could serve. So I think that's a really good place to be. I often say, I sort of give like 3 steps, I suppose. So one is learn, educate yourself. I will plug my workshop because that's always a good one. I'm doing a workshop in February the 11th. It's kind of in two parts. So the morning is just a general LGBT inclusion workshop for yoga, movement, mindfulness teachers. And then the afternoon is a sort of add-on specifically around pregnancy and postnatal. So you either can do the two parts together, or if you've already done my 3-hour workshop previously, you can join just for the afternoon. If you don't want to learn with me, that's also totally fine. There are loads of other amazing teachers sharing this kind of knowledge. So if you want some other recommendations, I can also put them out there. So the first part is learning. The second part is practice, because like you say, you will get it wrong. I get it wrong all the time. It happens. But one of the ways that we can help to mitigate that is practicing, getting used to the language, feeling it out, finding the way it sounds in your voice. And then from that place, then you might think about how could you reach out? How could you broaden who you share your knowledge with? Because as yoga teachers, we have so much to offer, and sometimes I feel like the people who need it most are the people who don't actually get in the room. The people who get in the room sometimes will absolutely benefit from it, but they don't need it. And then
I think that's true. I think that's true of any person participating in yoga, that the people who often need it the most are the people who are not in the room.
Yes, absolutely. And I was just going to end with that the journey continues. There's sort of no end point, not in a scary, I'm never going to get this right way, but just that, you know, in the 5 years that I've been doing this work, it's changed and evolved. And so you can learn from me now, but in 2 years' time, you might want to revisit it and just, you know, check the pulse of what's going on within the community and what language is preferred at that point. So kind of it goes through that cycle of learn, practice, implement, and then you go back and learn more and practice more and implement more. Yeah.
Amazing. Wow. Okay. Well, firstly, I want to really thank you for taking the time to chat with me and to chat with me so openly and to help me on my journey of understanding. It was really quite interesting, as I said, as I was preparing this workshop and knowing about your workshop in February, that there is an overlap, because originally I didn't think there was, but then all of a sudden you start discovering it's much more nuanced than we always originally perceive it to be. So thank you, Gabi. I really, really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with me, with everyone who's listening. And as both Gabi and I have said, I have a workshop happening on the 18th of October, Monday, fertility challenges, and Gabi has her fantastic workshop happening in February, her 2-part workshop. And all the information on both of those workshops can be found at the Yoga Teachers Forum on the course calendar. So you can register for both those workshops there. And are we done? I don't know.
I think so.
I feel we will carry on talking for ages and ages.
Easily. I could go all day.
Okay. Well, thank you, Gabi. Thank you, everyone who's listening, who's watching. And you can reach out to me or Gabi for any extra information. I think that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jacqueline.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.